What up, y'all? It's that time again, episode 28 of Star Crazy, all over your YouTubes, where we talk real shit about the news, brought to you by the Real News Network. I'm your host, Kim Brown. Coming up on today's program, hi, yes, Nicolas Maduro, y'all, shook up all the suckers. He and Venezuela are still standing strong after the Trump administration got caught looking so goofy trying to facilitate an invasion. Just think Bay of Pigs plus a global pandemic. It was pretty crazy, just ridiculous all around. We're going to get into that in here from President Maduro himself after he addressed the Venezuelan people. Also, um, we know the country is in a hurry to reopen, at least a decent majority of Republican controlled states. And if it's so safe to open the economy, then why is it that GOP lawmakers are pushing so hard for businesses and corporations to have legal liability protections against them getting sued by employees and customers if they happen to contract COVID 19? We're going to get into that as well. Plus, today is Cinco de Mayo, and hopefully, because of social distancing and sheltering in place, there won't be a bunch of drunk college students wearing sombreros hanging out at the bars. How in the world did this get co opted and become so misunderstood as to what this day actually means to Mexico? We're going to get into that as well. And of course, we always want to hear from y'all. We know y'all get it cracking in the chat and in the comments. So be sure to do that. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe as well. Well, now, time to bring in our panel. Of course, we always like to have a great mix of folks to stir up the conversation and to keep everything flowing nicely. So, of course, I'd like to introduce our senior producer, Don Rojas. He is senior producer here at The Real News. Don, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be back on the show, Kim. Thank you.
Yes, and we also like to welcome racial justice and labor activists, international activists as well, Bill Fletcher. Bill, I can't tell where you're coming to us from. You look like you're somewhere interstellar.
You were absolutely right. I'm in orbit around the Earth in my Klingon battle cruiser, but otherwise I'm usually in Maryland.
Nice. Okay, I wonder if you took off from College Park Airport right up the street. That would be pretty cool.
Indeed. Thanks for having me on the program.
He touches down in Maryland from time to time to see how we Earthlings are doing.
That's exactly right.
From time to time. Well, we certainly appreciate you touching down today on Stir Crazy. Well, of course, today is Cinco de Mayo, everybody. Happy Cinco de Mayo, if this is something that you celebrate. And, let's take a quick look at what some learned folks had to say as to what Cinco de Mayo actually is and what it really means. Let's see that tweet from Greg Carr, Dwayne. So Greg Carr is the head of Africana Studies at Howard University, and he put this up today. He said, on Cinco de Mayo, remember Battle of Puebla and Mexico's anti-slavery roots and Black-brown unity in resistance to settler colonialism. This holiday marks the fact that on this day in 1862, Mexico struck a blow against the invaders, the French invaders. Gentlemen, who would like to weigh in first on the true meaning of Cinco de Mayo? Because contrary to mainstream American belief, it's Mexican Independence Day, and it is absolutely not Mexican Independence Day.
No, that's correct. So what happened is that when the U.S. Civil War started, the French under then Louis Napoleon thought that this was a time to rebuild the French Empire in the Western Hemisphere. And so they took advantage of the US Civil War in order to invade Mexico. And they landed around Veracruz in southern Mexico and started marching towards Mexico City. They were defeated, as Greg pointed out, in the Battle of Puebla. And it's interesting because May 5th is celebrated as Cinco de Mayo, actually mainly among Chicanos in the southwest of the United States, but also in Mexico. But it's also commemorated in France because the French forces, in their view, fought a noble battle but lost. So the French were temporarily defeated. They returned and then captured Mexico, installed a puppet, the Emperor Maximilian, and held on to Mexico until about 1867. And during that time, there was a rebellion that was going on against the French, and the French and Maximilian's mercenaries were eventually defeated by Benito Juarez.
Don, I know you wanted to weigh in a little bit.
No, I mean, Bill said it all, and Greg, of course, nailed it in his tweet. That's the historical essence of it. It is a big celebration in the Southwest among Mexican American Chicanos, not so much in Mexico itself. But it has also become a day where Mexican Americans express pride in their history, pride in their ethnicity. Of course, under the current circumstances with the lockdown, the COVID lockdown, there probably won't be any street celebrations around the country. But yes, it is a day where Mexicans can hold their heads high and be proud of their own history, as it has been laid out by Bill.
I'd like to bring in our third guest for today's show. Laura Carlsen is joining us today. Laura is the director of the Americas program of the Center for International Policy. Laura, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation.
So we're talking about Cinco de Mayo and the actual meaning of Cinco de Mayo, but for some reason the historical accuracy of what Cinco de Mayo seems to be lost on America at large. In your opinion, how and why did this particular holiday get co-opted in such a way that it's an excuse for non-Mexican people to go out at bars and get really drunk celebrating Cinco de Mayo?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it is true, as the other commentators have mentioned, that it's a much bigger holiday in the southwestern part, especially, and in many parts, Chicago and other parts as well, where there's big immigrant community in the United States than it is here in Mexico. And I think that that's basically because the symbolism of the people rejecting a foreign invader, a European foreign invader, became very important to the Chicano movement back in the 70s, and so of the historical national holidays in Mexico, it became the one that in many ways most resonated to this construction of identity in the United States. And then what's happened since then is what's happened to almost all major holidays in the United States, that the capitalist culture of consumerism has taken over. There was, there's a very beautiful part of it, which celebrates Mexican culture, especially in the context of the hostility toward Mexicans and toward everything that has to do with Mexico, which of course has increased during the Trump administration. So the cultural part has always been very important, but little by little that has meant creating, transforming that cultural statement into products, into consumerism, and losing the political significance of it.
Gang, there's a lot
Excuse me,
happening.
Kim, I couldn't hear a thing that Laura said. I don't know. There's a problem on my end. I couldn't hear her. I could see her.
Okay, well, Dwayne's he's gonna take care of that for us, Don. But
right.
Guys, I wanted to move along, but stick with Mexico, because in addition to today being Cinco de Mayo, Mexico is also dealing with the effects of COVID-19. And there have been a number of worker strikes in Mexico along border towns with the U.S., Mexicans working at U.S.-owned factories owned by corporations. And they have been protesting not only the working conditions, hazard pay, but the fact that the factories won't close, or they would only close for brief periods of times and then quickly reopen. But they threatened workers' jobs, saying that if they refuse to come to work, despite the fact that according to President Lopez Obrador, the non-essential factories should have been closed, but a lot of these owners kept the factories open, and the workers obviously took big umbrage with that. This piece was actually in Truth Out. It's by David Bacon. Very interesting, and check it out. Don, I wanted to get your take on how the growing labor force is really asserting itself during this pandemic, not only out of necessity and survival, but an effort to achieve some gains that have been owed for an extremely long time.
Yeah. Well, we witnessed on May Day, May 1st, a number of actions taken by workers in establishments across the country. Amazon, Target, Walmart. There were one-day strikes, walkouts, protests of various types. There were many solidarity actions across the country in support of workers and also in celebrating International Workers' Day. Hopefully, this indicates that there is a resurgence of workers' fight back activities, a resurgence of working class consciousness among workers in the United States, who are, of course, suffering disproportionately from all of the measures being taken in the COVID crisis. Just look at the horrible conditions in the meatpacking plants across the country. These plants have some of the worst working conditions you can think of, and the infection rates are extremely high, and many are predicting that these meatpacking plants can be the new epicenter for the spread of the COVID virus. But here in Baltimore, Maryland, for example, on May Day itself, there were caravans of supporters going around the city to places where workers have been forced, in a way, to continue to work under terrible conditions, to express their solidarity. There's also now a call for another walkout on June the 1st. So hopefully this momentum that was generated a few days ago will carry on throughout the month of June. There was a call by Amazon workers not to shop at Amazon on May 1. Don't quite know how successful that was, but the fact is that we are seeing a new energy developing among the working people in the United States. I must point out also that there is a very high percentage of immigrant workers from Latin America, from Mexico and other Latin American countries, who are enduring the most horrible working conditions inside some of these meat and poultry processing plants. And the unions that are trying to protect their interests have, in fact, also been speaking out to the media about the conditions that prevail. So I'm hoping that the nation as a whole will have its public awareness expanded as to the plight of immigrant workers in these factories. We shall see if this new energy continues to build momentum. I am hopeful and optimistic that it will, and we hopefully will see the larger labor movement coalesce around the meatpacking workers' resistance. So we'll see how things go in the next few weeks.
Laura, I wanted to quote from Bacon's piece. He says, quote, "At first, workers in the factories took action to shut them down, a move widely supported in border cities. But as the owners themselves resisted, they got help of the U.S. government. The Trump administration put enormous pressure on the Mexican government and economy vulnerable because of its dependence on the U.S. market. I mean, even in countries abroad, which of course we know, U.S. corporations are managing to screw over worse workers in other countries than they are doing workers here. What are your thoughts about the influence that the U.S. is having over Mexican health policy, basically forcing workers to remain at factories that ultimately refuse to close, thereby putting them at greater risk of contracting coronavirus?
Yeah, that influence is especially noted here in Mexico because Mexico is so dependent on the US economy. So we just did a major report on the wildcat strikes on the northern border in the offshore assembly plants, which are called maquiladoras. And in the Americas program at americas.org. And what happened was that they began to see that they were being forced back into businesses that were non-essential and had already been designated as non-essential at a time when some of those border states are among the highest in incidence of COVID-19. And so the workers, they were actually seeing some of their fellow workers dying, getting sick and dying of COVID-19, and they began to strike to be able to protect their lives by not having to go into an unprotected work environment. Then the United States government, as you mentioned, stepped in. There were negotiations with the Mexican government, and it looks like the reopening of those maquiladora plants. Some of them closed because they were forced to close by the state and federal governments. Some of them were supposed to close and remained open clandestinely, and then some of them that were designated essential remained open. And it looks like that agreement is imminent to force workers to go back into those plants. So absolutely, what you're seeing is the interests of the United States economy being posed on what should be a sovereign health policy here in Mexico at a time, and this is really important to take into effect, that we are just entering the worst period of contagion for COVID-19 that we're likely to see, according to all the experts. Mexico is behind the curve of the United States. The United States goes into a part where in many parts of the country, the number of deaths are going down, ours are going up. This is our critical period for stopping or for putting the brakes on the contagion with a health system that, as a poor country, it's a big economy, but there are a lot of poor people in it, does not have the infrastructure to take a huge influx of patients. So there's going to be a lot more protests about this. We're waiting to see what kind of an agreement will happen, but the pressure's also coming because of those so-called vertical supply chains. So in the United States, they're starting to reopen the auto plants, and that means that they need the inputs that are made in Mexico in order to produce. And so they don't care if Mexico is still in a hugely dangerous moment. They want those inputs, and they're forcing Mexico to reopen to get that supply chain moving again.
Laura,
can I ask Laura a question real quick?
I was going to ask her one too.
Okay.
But
yeah,
go
Laura,
ahead, Don, go first.
Just wondering how the Mexican government and the progressive president have been withstanding the pressure from Washington. Have they been caving to that pressure, or are they putting up some form of resistance on the part of in defense of their own national sovereignty? I mean, I know that the White House, the Trump White House, has been probably maximizing its pressure through the State Department on the
Mexican government has not been good at standing up to the United States government on many issues, again, because of that dependency. They feel like they're vulnerable. The progressive government has this agenda of broad changes and feels like entering into any kind of conflict with the Trump administration will jeopardize that agenda, which means that some of the basic principles, in my opinion, of that agenda are compromised. One of them is the sovereignty in terms of the health policy. And then we'll wait and see what this agreement says, but there's a likelihood that the federal government will go for the reopening and that some of the state governments will as well. And of course, the area in which we've really seen the Mexican government cave in terms of influence from the White House is immigration.
Yes.
Bill,
Okay.
I wanted to give you an opportunity to weigh in here, and I wanted to read another quote from David Bacon's piece, because he quotes the governor of Baja California, Governor Bonilla. And what Governor Bonilla said at a press conference recently was, quote, "The employers don't want to stop earning money." He said they are basically looking to sacrifice their employees. But now he's allowing a lot of non-essential factories to open, so there's that. So, Bill, I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in here.
I think what we're seeing planetary-wise is what I like to call capitalism at its swinest, and that we are looking at an absolute brutality and a willingness of the employer class to do whatever they need to do. And I think that there's two elements I want to just highlight. One is social Darwinism, and the other is Trump's electoral agenda. So we have our election coming up in November in the United States, and Trump was approaching this up through February with the assumption that he was going to be reelected. Whether he was is irrelevant. That was the assumption, and that he would be waving the flag of a vibrant economy. And now an unprecedented healthcare and economic crisis is hit with record unemployment. And he and his minions are completely befuddled. They have no idea what to do. And they're obviously hoping that by pushing for the so-called reopening of the economy, that they can develop some semblance of normality by November so that people will remember the good old days, and they'll think that Trump, if he receives another term, will do what he has to do. And to obtain that, they're willing to do whatever. And that means crushing workers, forcing people to go back to work, whether in the United States or Mexico. The other thing that I think is important that rose to the surface in the beginning of March through various elements of the right wing's echo chamber is what was known as social Darwinism, a theory raised and debunked in the 19th century at the same time of scientific racism, and a basic idea that the survival of the fittest in an economy. And what's being articulated by the Republicans is, and in varying ways from the traditional Republicans to the fascists, is the idea that this pandemic has been overstated, that yes, people may get sick, but they'll recover. Yes, people will die, but they're mainly old and infirm. And after all, who cares? Because what we've got to do is really restore the economy. And so you have that in operation right now. And that is also affecting the way the administration and others are looking at Mexico. Mexico is sacrificial lamb as far as they're concerned in order to restart the economy.
Mexico, apparently Black Americans, Native Americans, Latino Americans, anyone that's a frontline essential worker, from doctors to grocery store workers, everyone is expendable in the eyes of this Trump administration as of late. Well, speaking of Donald Trump, he is scheduled to go for a visit to Arizona today, his first time leaving the White House in about a month. He's scheduled to tour the Honeywell aerospace facility that, according to USA Today, is expanding its production of N95 respirator masks. Obviously, Arizona is also a battleground state for the president, and but it's also a state where there is a disproportionate amount of COVID-19 infections amongst the indigenous population there relative to their portion of the population. So there is that. Gang, there was a piece in the Texas Tribune that I thought was articulate in the sense that we've sort of discussed this on this program before. It's by Ross Ramsey, and he says, if reopening the economy is risky, then who's getting protection? And the crux of his piece is if it's so critical for all these states to reopen stores, to reopen restaurants, even at limited capacities, then why is it that Senate Republicans like Mitch McConnell are pushing for legal liability protections for businesses to prevent them from being sued by employees and by customers also as well? And the thing about Texas is pretty interesting because Greg Abbott has reopened portions of Texas. This is after they had their biggest spike in single day deaths at 50. And they have, I think, almost maybe just shy of 1,000 total deaths from COVID. But what Ross puts out in his piece, I thought was pretty interesting. He says, and if it's not dangerous, then what's the need for blanket immunity? The proposal gives business owners a get out of jail free card while forcing their employees back into potentially dangerous workplaces, luring customers through potentially hazardous storefronts, and taking away the recourse these workers and customers would otherwise have against the people trying to profit off of their labor and purchases. Bill, I want to start with you because you were just talking about people being sacrificial lambs. This includes customers and employees in the eyes of a lot of these lawmakers and these corporations.
Well, Kim, what's funny about this in a sick way is that it reminds us that all of the rhetoric that comes out of the Republican Party about big government, too many regulations, things like that, is all dispensable when they are in trouble. That is, the capitalists are in trouble. I have this ongoing argument with a very wealthy relative of mine who is very conservative, and he would regularly talk about the private sector can do it better, do everything better than the public sector. And I've pointed out to him that time and again that these rich private sector folks are fine with no government intervention when they're doing okay. But the moment that they get in trouble, they start going to the government trough looking for help. That's what's happening here. They're basically saying they're taking a preemptive strike against working people and against customers. And they're saying, let's guarantee for our rich friends that they will be impervious to any kind of charges. And that thereby assuming that will lead to these companies going forward and reopening, fully reopening. I think that what they may discover, though, is what has been happening, which is that workers in these different places are, whether they have a union or not, are striking or carrying out other kinds of job actions that are going to disrupt this whole situation. And I think that has to continue.
Yeah. Let me just weigh in on this real quick, Tim. I think that, front and center of the Republican agenda is the defense and the advancement of the interest of big capital, the 1%, so to speak. You've seen it in the tax cuts that they ran through that would assist the wealthiest capitalists in the country. You see what we're witnessing is a state public welfare program for the 1%. In other words, socialism for the rich and capitalism for the working class and for the poor. And that is what's been driving the Republican agenda led by Mitch McConnell, who I am happy to say seems to be in a bit of a struggle against his opponent in Kentucky. There's even the looming question that he may lose his seat at the upcoming election. But here we have a government, a federal government, that is supposed to defend and protect all of the people of the country, all of the citizens of the United States, choosing instead to put the full weight of the U.S. government behind the interests of Wall Street and behind the interest of the richest billionaires and millionaires in the country. So what the COVID virus has done is it has ripped off the scab and has exposed the deep wound that is the internal crisis of capitalism. And there is no solution for this crisis. And so what they do basically is to try to solve this crisis on the backs of working people and step up the exploitation and oppression of working people in the United States and around the world. If the coronavirus outbreak has done anything, it has exposed the socioeconomic divides in the United States and indeed around the world, and which has disproportionately impacted the working classes in the U.S. and around the world.
Comment from the comments. Reptile Z says the current American reality is that we have a madman who has his hand on the throttle of death. Well, I no disagreement there. I mean, Laura. I mean, there is no economy without both workers and consumers, and again, because the United States has such a poor healthcare system. There's poor infrastructure. I mean, as Don said, all of this is being laid quite bare in the midst of a global emergency. But at the same time, they say that the economy is tanking. But if everyone is sick, or if people don't have the access to adequate healthcare, then you don't really have consumers, nor do you have workers.
Right, and it's a huge contradiction that it's not at all clear how it's going to be resolved. We were talking with immigrants in New York lately, where they were seeing the worst of it, and the situation for people who worked in, it's called the gig economy, but of course here we call it the informal economy because it's just you do anything you can to have some food to eat that day. And for people, especially in this situation, it's an impossible dilemma to keep safe or to be able to eat that day, which is also obviously an important health issue. So we're seeing people who are trying to make that decision on a daily basis, abandoned by governments, essentially. They're street vendors, they're sex workers, they're subsistence farmers. And it turns out that, like in the case of the subsistence farmers, these are the people who actually do feed us. In the case of the farm workers who harvest, even on the large farms, these are the people who keep food on our tables. Eventually, there's the ideal that the economy will return to some stable state. It's definitely looking like it's in the long term, but it's very clear to most people that it's going to have to come back with new priorities and with a complete restructuring in terms of not only distribution that we've been talking about for a long time, the 1%, but also what kind of work do we actually value? We've seen care work become visible, and at the same time there's almost no proposals to compensate it or to take care of caregivers. This is work where women work, and it's no coincidence that the devaluing of care work has to do with the fact that it's feminine and vice versa. So we still aren't seeing programs that would compensate women for doing childcare, that would compensate, that would provide funds to keep them safe in the home when they're shut up in the home, because the home is the most dangerous place for women in terms of domestic violence. We haven't seen those kinds of deep structural reforms that we really need to move forward.
Very well said. Thank you so much for pointing that out, because I was thinking that recently, like, wow, a lot of these frontline workers, these essential workers, are occupations largely held by women, and it's scary, and it is not valued, nor is it compensated to the level of risk that is being assumed and taken right now. So thank you so much for pointing that out, Laura. Gang, I wanted to move along because on the international stage, the United States never misses an opportunity to flat out embarrass itself or embarrass its citizens, or just flat out cause terror in places where it has interests. And apparently, a gang of U.S. mercenaries were captured in Venezuela trying to facilitate an invasion of the nation. Donald Trump has denied any knowledge of this. He gave some comments in the White House where he said, quote, "We'll find out. We just heard about it," end quote. And but President Nicolas Maduro didn't waste any time addressing his nation and saying what needed to be said.
Para poder referirme a otros temas, porque hice un llamado a dejar las rencillas, los conflictos, las peleas a un lado y hacer un gran acuerdo de paz, un gran acuerdo humanitario para afrontar la pandemia pavorosa del mundo. Y ese llamado lo ratifiqué 20, 30 veces. Y le dije al pueblo, me perdonan, pero estoy obligado a decirle, se está preparando contra Venezuela desde Colombia un ataque terrorista de grupos que se han entrenado, financiados y apoyados por el gobierno de Colombia de Iván Duque y por el gobierno de los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica. Que es redundar, pues. ¿Cómo redundar? El gobierno de los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica decidió utilizar el tiempo de la pandemia para un ataque terrorista, para llenar de violencia a Venezuela y tener la justificación para otra escalada militar de amenaza y de intervención que llevara a tratar de lograr lo que no han logrado ni lograrán, que es desviar la atención de la opinión pública mundial y de la opinión pública de Estados Unidos sobre la crisis trágica de la pandemia del coronavirus en los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica y en Europa. Estados Unidos se convirtió hace un mes en el centro mundial de la crisis del coronavirus.
Yup. Co-sign everything he said. Now ask me what he said. My interpretation, and if we have some fluent Spanish speakers, by all means, please let us know what the president said. But for what I can glean was, in the middle of a pandemic, these suckers want to try to come take me out of my own country on my own home soil. I'm talking to you, Duque in Colombia. I'm talking to you, Estados Unidos de Norte America. I mean, I know Maduro had all the smoke. Can someone offer up a better translation than what I am putting forth?
Well, he also talked about the fact that he had offered a kind of a truce at this time so that both countries could deal with really serious human toll of the pandemic, and instead we got this. And that's not all. There was an increase in the sanctions against Venezuela. There was a measure that would actually confiscate the oil money from Citgo in the United States and give it directly to the minority opposition in its nonstop efforts for regime change. It's been the same with Cuba. They've intensified sanctions. So instead of seeing a humanitarian truce that would put most emphasis on saving human lives wherever they are, what we're seeing is that under the cover of COVID, the Trump administration is pushing forward these aggressive regime change policies in order, thinking that that people won't be able to respond as they might normally respond in protest at other times. And this is of course true, and we have to be very alert about what's happening. He announced a new war on drugs in Latin America. I don't know if people remember this, but it was very important because this war on drugs that he announced, first of all, why are we launching a war with warships in the Caribbean at a time when all resources are needed to fight the pandemic? And secondly, it turns out it wasn't a war on drugs in Latin America. It was a military deployment in the Caribbean, obviously to threaten Venezuela. So this has been going on, and we have to pay more attention because it's going to intensify.
Yeah, no, that's right. This Bay of Pigs light, if you want to call it that, attempt at an invasion, or attempt at smuggling in a group of terrorists, was staged and prepared and planned in Colombia, Venezuela's next door neighbor, which, by the way, happens to be the very epicenter of the export of drugs to North America and to Europe. They are not going to be satisfied. They, meaning the State Department and the U.S. government, not going to be satisfied until they find a way to overthrow Maduro. But it's not going to be easy because Maduro has the support of the Venezuelan military. He still has some popular support, even though the economic crisis in his country has undermined the support of many of the working people of Venezuela who have left the country seeking a better life in neighboring countries. But he still has the support of, I would say, the majority of the working class Venezuelan and of the military. This brazen attempt in the middle of a pandemic, by the way, where Venezuela has been showing that they are managing the pandemic and mitigating the effects on their population far more efficiently than many of the other Latin American countries. So this aggression against Venezuela is not going to let up. It is part and parcel of a long tradition of interference, military intervention in Latin America by the United States, going all the way back to the so-called Monroe Doctrine in the middle of the 19th century, which sort of gave the right to Washington to interfere in the domestic affairs of all the countries in the Western Hemisphere, and that included all of the Latin American and Caribbean countries. So we have to keep our eyes open as to the next steps. This particular attempt failed, but there will be more down the pipe, and Trump will continue to lie and to say that he knows nothing about it or to deflect it. But the United States will continue to not only tighten the sanctions, as Laura said, on Venezuela and Cuba, but attempt further military adventures against those two countries in particular.
I mean, not only just sanctions, the United States has charged President Maduro in connection with drug trafficking. Like, they charged him in actual federal court. And Bill, I wanted you to get in here, but I wanted to read a couple more details as reported by The Guardian. Apparently in this incident, there were 8 people that were killed during the incursion attempt on Sunday. This is according to Venezuelan authorities. Now, Maduro showed during his presser what he said were U.S. passports and other identification cards belonging to Altran Berry and Luke Denman, who he said were in custody and had been cooperating with Gordon Gautreaux, an American military veteran who leads a Florida-based security company called Silvercorp USA. The fact that the U.S. is employing mercenaries here, obviously not a new strategy for U.S. Foreign policy, but given the fact that we are in a pandemic and the U.S., particularly the Trump administration, does not appear to be taking any days off when it comes to fucking with our so-called enemies, so to speak.
Kim, the thing that we have to appreciate about this situation is the Trump administration didn't necessarily have to have done anything. They may not be tied in with this, but what they've done, it's sort of like a scene from that movie John Wick 3, where there's a hit that's put on the John Wick, who's played by Keanu Reeves, and it's a massive hit. I mean, the amount of money that is put out in the contract for whoever is able to whack him. In effect, what Trump did was put out a contract on Maduro. And basically, whether there was the direct CIA involvement, whether these were mercenaries that wanted to take advantage, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, this starts and stops with Trump. They were the ones, as you just pointed out, that talked about this ridiculous so-called drug war. You want to have a drug war? Go to war with Colombia, right? It's completely ridiculous. It's disingenuous. So they did that. They basically put out a contract on Maduro. So at the end of the day, this all does fall to the Trump administration. And as others have said, this will continue. This is one of the reasons that U.S. presidential elections, U.S. elections, period, have global ramifications. We're not talking about an election in Andorra or Liechtenstein. We're talking about an election in a country where there is a authoritarian regime in power that wishes to expand further. Now, there's one other thing I want to add here, Kim. See, when Trump was running for election in 2016, he was mischaracterized by many people, including on the left, as an isolationist. In fact, there were some ultra-left groups in the United States that will go nameless that called Trump a closet peace candidate because he was making all of these arguments about disengaging from various wars around the world. The thing that we have to understand about isolationism in the United States is that it's not really isolationism. What it is a political movement that basically says we do not wish to be encumbered by any treaties, any global treaties, any global courts, any global regulations. We want to be able to do what we want to do when we want to do it and not be told that we cannot. That is the essence of Trump. So this idea of him as an isolationist, him not really wanting to be involved in various issues overseas, misses this entirely, which is one of the reasons that we are witnessing now this rabid attempt to undermine Cuba, Venezuela, and any other place that they can get their hands on.
Yeah, that's a whole lot there, Bill, because I mean, obviously we all watch these things, we witness them. These things are not done in our name. These are not things that at large the American people support, and yet we have to witness and be apologetic for and feel bad for the people that are directly affected by U.S. foreign policy in very destructive and genocidal ways a lot of times. And it's just really disgusting that this shit, it don't take a day off. I don't get it. Like, we are in a global health emergency, and yet coups are being planned. More sanctions are being imposed against Iran and Cuba and Venezuela. And it's like, do y'all take a break? Like, can we get back on track first, or do y'all have to continue, the imperialism at all times?
The empire never
sleeps. They have to continue, Kim.
Yeah.
They have to continue. But the other thing that makes it even more complicated is that hiding behind ignorance, millions of people in the United States, in the face of these facts, basically throw up their hands and say, we didn't know. We didn't know. We didn't know this was going on. And as if ignorance of these things somehow excuses us. You know, it's like the stories that they talk about after World War II, and they would ask these Germans, why didn't you do something when Hitler was picking up the communists, the socialists, the Jews, the Roma? And people would throw up their hands and say, oh, we didn't know. We didn't know it was happening. And it was pointed out, no. You knew as much as you wanted to know. And I think that's the issue in the United States, that too many people here hide behind ignorance and say, no, we didn't know. We didn't know about the race war in Guatemala that the United States funded. We didn't know about these different insurgencies. We didn't know about these assassinations. And at a certain point, the people of the world have the right to say, are you people idiotic? Are you just simply stupid in the United States? Or are you hiding behind this veil so that you do not have to take any steps in order to address the criminality of a country's leadership that does these things in your name? And that's the question. So no excuses. Let's deal with it. And that's why I think the real news is so important, to basically put this out. And it's so funny because I remember once a friend of mine said to me, he said, I am so furious with you. I said, well, why? He said, before I met you, I was happy and I was comfortable. And then you started talking all this stuff about US imperialism, everything. He says, I can't be happy anymore. Well, bottom line is, I don't want people to be happy. I want people to understand what the United States is doing. And this criminality that you pointed out in Venezuela, this happens every day around the world, whether it's against Iran, and I'm no friend or I'm not fond at all of the Iranian regime, but the United States has no business destabilizing that, or the genocide that the US is helping to perpetrate against the Palestinian people, along with the Israelis. And people here will sit back and say, I don't know anything about Palestine. Well, damn it, learn something about it.
Yeah. Google is your friend at all times, y'all. So I wanted to switch gears if we could for a minute, because there is a bit of good news, although it is born out of strict necessity. But the rise of mutual aid in this country, people helping other people, communities canvassing together, pooling resources, making sure that vulnerable folks are able to get the things that they need, and even trying to keep some small businesses in business. This is the case with a local nonprofit in the Bay Area, which came up with an interesting idea. So what they do, well, first of all, the nonprofit is called Off the Plate. It raises money to give directly to a local restaurant, and then that restaurant makes meals and brings them to people who are working on the front lines, especially in particular, in this case, healthcare workers. Laura, and I'm assuming that this is a broad thing, right? Communities coming together to help each other is not anything new, but we've seen a sharp increase in this need for communities to step up for one another, whereas local, state, and federal governments have been really falling short during the pandemic.
Absolutely, Kim. We're seeing it in all the countries of Latin America, as well as in the United States, among the migrant communities that I mentioned before. People are organizing to find out what families on their block in East Harlem are experiencing hunger, are shut in, have lost their jobs, and they're taking food baskets to those, and they're taking a risk. They're taking all the protective measures, but they're taking a risk. One of the other interesting things that we've seen a lot here are indigenous communities in particular are coming forth with the kind of communal organized responses that they have practiced for millennium, and they are applying them to this point in the pandemic, a point in which their own communities are particularly vulnerable, but in which some of the knowledge of how to take care of community has become particularly useful. So we're seeing that in Guatemala, we're seeing that here in Mexico, we're seeing that on the reservations in the United States. And many people are beginning to look to those indigenous communities to learn more about some of those communal forms of organization. It's something that in some ways is just getting started, but other people are becoming involved because people are recognizing a personal responsibility. One of the good things that happens at a moment of universal crisis like this, and it's something I remember my grandmother talking to me about the Depression, is that the whole line that people are poor or people are sick because they deserve to be that way, especially people are poor because they just didn't make it, it crumbles. And we begin to see the judgments fall and the humane impulse to help others flourish.
Yes. If there is a silver lining among the dark clouds of this pandemic, it is example after example of human solidarity, human empathy that we are witnessing from the West Coast and all over the country, as a matter of fact. And just the demonstration of empathy and care and concern for our fellow human beings is the exact opposite of what we are witnessing in terms of the approach of the Trump administration. I mean, Trump is a man devoid of empathy. 100%. He is only about himself. He is a pathological, malignant narcissist. But nonetheless, we do have, and I would say the majority of the American people are decent, and they are showing that decency that is based in their souls and in their hearts in these acts of charity, acts of solidarity, acts of mutual aid and support. Before we sign off, Kim, if you'd allow me just to say that the pandemic of coronavirus is unleashing another pandemic around the world. The pandemic of hunger, growing hunger, a pandemic of unemployment. The United Nations came out with a study yesterday or the day before in which they talked about half of the world's working people, 1.8 billion people around the world, have no form of livelihood to look forward to in the days ahead. And the UN World Food Program is warning about famines of biblical proportions if urgent action is not taken to ameliorate the effects of the collapsing economies, particularly in the global south. We are talking about an international, a global crisis of proportions that we have never witnessed in our lifetime. We are heading towards a global depression, and that is going to unleash suffering, unspeakable suffering, that would include the death of millions and millions of people from hunger in a world that where hunger should not prevail anywhere. I mean, the world is producing enough food to feed all of its people. But this is the essence of the contradictions of neoliberal capitalism that we are witnessing in the United States and around the world.
Bill, I wanted to let you hop in here.
I don't know that I can add much, Kim. I very much agree with what Don and Laura was saying. I remain optimistic. This is going to be a very difficult period. And the main thing I want to emphasize is that we cannot afford to fall into apocalyptic scenarios. There's too many of them on Facebook and others where we're basically being told that the world is about to end in one way or another. And these apocalyptic scenarios are very demobilizing. They scare people to the point where they turn inward, and they're afraid to reach out and do what Laura and Don was saying. They're afraid to act in solidarity, and they become very much focused on themselves. So I think that we have to be thinking always about what can be done to turn the situation around and come out of this with a humane global society that's at peace with nature.
Well, there was one patriot that was out at one of the Reopen the Economy rallies. I wasn't able to figure out exactly which city this was in, but when I saw this young man and what he decided to step up and do in the face of such ignorance, I just had to salute him. Let's check it out.
God hates dipshits. Fuck you. 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 Fuck you.
Thanks for coming.
Fuck you. Thank you. Fuck you. Fuck you. God hates dipshits. Fuck you. Fuck you.
Can you explain?
Give me a little more of that, will you? I love it.
Explain why you're just saying fuck you and being vile to everybody?
These people are risking people's lives, including your own.
They are not.
They are.
Yeah,
I expect none of these people.
I suppose, don't
I do believe in science.
You're so full of
I do
shit.
believe in science.
You're so full of shit.
Okay, yep, science is wrong. Yep, fuck you.
No, science is
Fuck
right.
you. Science is right.
Have you looked at the models, idiot?
Yep, I have looked at the models.
And what do they look like?
Bad.
They go from 2.5 million dead to under 50,000.
Fuck you.
More people are killed by the.
Fuck you.
Yeah, you're
Oh,
an
it's just
idiot.
the flu. I know, it's just the flu. It's a virus. Fuck
Yeah,
you.
it is.
You will never mistake me for being a classy broad, because this is the kind of content that I am totally here for. Panel, what's your take? I mean, I know, sure, it's a little bit on the crass side, and for people who call for civility and blah, 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 but you know what? Sometimes you have to remind people that God does not love dipshits, although I think God does have a soft spot for dipshits, though.
I think it's marvelous. And I think that what we have to do is recognize that this is not about civility. These anti-social distancing people that have come to rallies with guns. The last time I checked, guns and bullets do not do much when it comes to fighting viruses. And so they're coming to intimidate, they're coming to threaten civil war. And so this is not about civility. And I think that it's absolutely right to call these people out. You know, it's like I wrote something recently where I basically argued that if people don't want to social distance, then there should be an affidavit that they sign that basically says that I am not going to follow social distancing. And therefore, if I get sick, I waive my rights to healthcare. And if I infect anyone under the age of 18 in my household or anyone outside of my household, I will accept criminal prosecution. See, now I think if we go to some of these right wingers and ask them, are you ready to sign this? I mean, you're libertarians, you don't want the government involved. So that's fine. So why don't you waive your rights? We need to call them out on this insanity. They are basically saying it's okay for the rest of us to die to serve them. That's really what's going on here. And that's what goes back to what I said about social Darwinism. It's actually even worse than social Darwinism.
Gang, does anybody want to comment on that Patriots video? A true patriot, in my opinion.
That sounds like a good rallying cry to me.
I like the one where in the protests, there were actually protests where the trucks blocked the entrance to hospitals.
That's right.
And I can't remember where it was either. It might have been in Michigan. And the health workers, and there were health workers who came out to loan, after who knows how many hours on the job, in their scrubs, in their masks, and just stood in the middle of the road. Yeah. There were people who also had signs that said, stay home so I can go home sometime, Yeah. And in our family, we have frontline health workers, and so I found that to be extremely effective. These are people that arguments are not going to work with. We already know that these are people who should be subjected to the laws because that's what they're there for. And it's a critical moment to protect us. And so it is a time for strong statements.
Absolutely. Well, gang, we have come to the end of our hour, but before we go, I just wanted to remind everyone that's watching to like and subscribe, of course, but it is also Giving Tuesday, and we here at The Real News are a nonprofit organization. So if you'd like to drop us a couple of dollars, feel free to go to our website, therealnews.com, and click the donate button. Anything that you give, we would appreciate, because we are an independent news media outlet. We do not receive any corporate funding or any government funding either. So you can count on us to tell you all the truth, basically, is what I'm saying. I'd like to thank our fantastic panel for joining us. Thank you so much, Don Rojas, Laura Carlsen, Bill Fletcher. You guys were fantastic. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kim.
And gang, tune in tomorrow for more Stir Crazy right here on The Real News. I'm Kim Brown. Y'all be easy peasy.